it's lovely to be here. Lots of familiar faces and old friends and people I've corresponded with over the years. Amazing, we're all in one room. I treasure this. So I've got quite a bit of time actually, and there are other speakers packed up behind me. So I thought what I would do is tell a bit about the story of telling my story and how that's played out in the 8 years since I sort of first came out as a boarding school survivor, and then talk a bit about campaigning ideas and how we go forward as a group of people who want to stop children today suffering what we suffered, and then have lots of questions and answers, and then we can get the next speakers up if we run out of time with me. But I'm not a great PowerPoint user, but right. So this is my boarding school survivor quote of the month for November. So I read it. I had a terrible upbringing. I had a lot of adversity growing up. One thing I worry about is my kids don't face enough adversity. It's the old validating rubbish, isn't it? Just dreadful. Any guesses on who that is? Literally in the last week. Yeah. Thank you. Karen McMillan wins the prize. And who's surprised? Looking at his Elon Musk. Anyone surprised? Looking at a bit of emotional, atypicality and chaotic relationship with the rest of the world. Thanks to the great Suzanne Zizak, who I'm sure you all know, who tweeted this article about him. And as she points out, the biography article in Investopedia.com, this whole range of aces, a much hated evil father, parental separation early boarding school, betrayal by friends and humiliation at that boarding school, leading him to believe his own children need to suffer as well in order to be special. And this is of course what keeps this awful mess going, as we all know. So I mean, a bit about me. That's me aged 8 on the way to Ashdown House School. That's September the 16th, 1969. The day my childhood ended, really. I was a very happy boy, brought up loving parents, family of 5. I was the oldest in Sussex, and with privilege and wealth. And like my father before me and 7 generations on my mother's side, I had to go to boarding school. I don't think there was ever any question about it. My mother, who didn't go to school at all, she grew up in the war and under governesses in rural Scotland, told me it was the best thing that would ever happen to me, and she wished she'd been able to go as her brothers had. So I didn't really have a choice about whether to enjoy it or not, or report back. But it wasn't my story is a very average boarding school survivor story in many ways. Not least in the fairly happy or very happy childhood, which then arrives at a really drastic breaking of attachment at 8 years old. But it was a more privileged boarding school story in that it was a very famous and expensive school, and starting on the same day as me, that small boy there is David Linley and Princess Margaret is standing. I think I was just behind them when that photo was taken. So I shared a dormitory with David Linley, Princess Margaret's son. So we were getting the very best of preparatory school boarding education under a man called Billy Williamson, who the thought of whom still makes me quake. He's the most terrifying person of my entire life. And I then went on to this school, which you'll probably recognise. I like that photo. But that didn't work, and I was expelled at 16. I was a very angry, chaotic young man. I engineered my expulsion, really. I had it with adult authority, and it all started with confirmation class, actually, because we all knew that the the eminent reverend who was taking confirmation class was keen on small boys, and I just said I wasn't going to put up with that anymore. And then I think I went through a story that a lot of you will be familiar to lots of you in terms of anger and emotional dysregulation and risk-taking and substance abuse, and I was an unhappy child and an unhappy young man. And but being privileged and having got some things out of this education, including a superficial self-confidence, once I'd sort of got myself together in my mid-20s, I prospered, and I got into journalism. I'd like to think it was my skills that got me that, but I think it was probably just as much my privilege and my old Etonian background. And I became mainly a news journalist, in that sort of anti-orthodox way that a lot of ex-boarders have through the decades. It's very easy to emerge from that system angry about it, and then try and be a thorn in the side of the establishment. But it's also a way of the establishment coping with those who object to what it has done to them. And I continued in my way as a sort of campaigning journalist, really. I went to work for Oxfam for a few years and for the beginnings of the online collectivism campaigns, until a day in just around Christmas 2013, when I opened someone sent me a copy of the Daily Mail, and on the front page the headline was about savage abuse at Boris Johnson's school, which was my school, Ashdown House, and how a group of boys were suing the school, and I photographed this and emailed it to my mother, and it's kind of my first instinct was to send it to my mother, and she phoned me She phoned me up and said, "Oh, gosh, I always wondered what happened to you at there." And I said, "Wow, Mum, why did you think anything happened to me there?" And she said, "Well, because you told me." And I said, "What did I tell you?" And I get emotional actually just talking about it. Sorry. I've done this so many times, it still gets to me. She told me that I told her that Mr. Keane, the maths master, was touching me in a way I didn't like. And I said, and I didn't remember telling her. I blocked the fact that I told her. And she'd been straight to she said, well, I went to the headmaster and I couldn't see him. I saw his wife and I made a complaint, and I was told, and she told me I was that your son must have made it up, because look at this beautiful place. Things like that could not possibly happen. And she said, and I agreed. I decided. I feel I was bullied, but your father said, let's not do anything more about it, and so we forgot about it. So that was a bit of a revelation, and I realised, of course, that if other friends of mine were also sorry about it. You never expect the tears when they come to you, but the others' friends were that I needed to support the boys who were suing the school, who I knew exactly what they were talking about. They were all 2 years younger, and I knew who the abusers were, though they hadn't abused me. But I clearly had first-hand evidence in the case of my mother, who could stand up and go, I knew this happened. So, but being a journalist in a magazine, mainly in magazines at that time, I was writing a lot for the Guardian Observer in long form. I decided to come out and talk it through for the Guardian, and that's the online version of the piece that came out on a very important day in my life, May the 14th, 2014, and it was. I mean, I wasn't the first to do it. I mean, you met many journalists, many people had already by 2014. Some very bravely and brilliantly talked through what happened to them in that system. I mean, what it got more attention perhaps because I was quite well known as a journalist and known as, you know, won awards for sort of war reporting and things like that. So I was, you know, I had this sort of official label as, you know, tough guy who works in the real world sort of thing, rather than, you know, an emotional person. So I think that got me more of an audience, and also the fact that my father was a Tory MP, and that kind of had a little bit of a bounce as well. But so you know, that, and it's sort of ironic that privilege which put me into that education system was also the privilege that got me my story heard. And that's something I have to acknowledge. That's not open to many survivors. But I think looking back at it, seems a long time ago, and I was a very innocent person when I decided to do this. And when we got to the sort of night before publication, I was in an absolute horror of conflicting emotions that I, you know, I mean, my wife prudently was training in trauma psychology and child psychology at the time, so I had someone I could really chew it through with. And I wasn't regretting what I'd done, but I could see coming out like that, I painted it with a lot of the negatives about myself already. I thought it was a narcissistic act, it was an act almost possibly of self-harm. You know, it was an act of revenge against the headmaster who bullied me so badly because I'd accused one of his teachers of sexual abuse. You know, which is, I'd say, that the root of the damage done to me was the bullying by the headmaster, not the abuse. I mean, or the bulk of it. And I think, and also, you know, you all recognise, you know, that sense of breaking the codes of silence. I was committing a crime against my class, against my parents, against the society, and it was. But I suppose I think often when you tell your story, that's the beginning of a learning process as well, and I think that started there. I was very. I mean, I'd read Nick Duffel. I'd been through, you know, I'd seen the making of them. I knew what I was dealing about. I don't think I knew what attachment theory meant. I was starting on a road. And what was great when it was published was actually almost all the outcomes were very good. I mean, the reaction was huge and really positive and kind from for most people who knew and loved me, and most people who knew me professionally as well. And the boarding school survivors community gathered people I didn't know really, like Simon Partridge and Nick Duffel and so on, and immediately wrote to me in support and, you know, and saying they'd like to help me or enlisting me to, you know, to help in campaigning, and that felt great because that's a family of people who understood. And the negatives were really very small. I had a savage reaction from some in my family, including my mother, who accused me of, well, there's no need to go into details, but she, you know, she's still alive. I mean, she remains in denial and very guilty feeling, and it's deeply problematic between us. But I've learnt to see her woundedness for what it is, and without, and I can handle her. And some friends, particularly the older Tonians, were savage. I went to a party with my wife in Edinburgh where we live, a posh art gallery opening event, that the following Friday, and a man I knew really quite well, I'm going to call him a friend, but we were sort of standing around with our party drinks in our hands in a circle, and he went, "Don't stand too close to Alex, he might put his hands down your shorts," which was directly lifted from the article. And that was a shock. And I had a few people go, someone actually used the phrase class traitor, but that made me giggle. And the next things that happened were really very, you know, I hadn't predicted at all, but were really shocking and interesting. So I'm just trying to find my notes here. I mean, the first thing that happened to me is others came forward and, to my enormous relief, said they'd also been abused by the same teacher. And that was absolutely vast, because I'd spent my school days being the school liar in the headmaster's words, and I'd always suspected, but I'd never known that anyone else was being given sweets by Mr. Keane in return for, the usual. So that was enormous, and then going to the police later that year taught me an awful lot as well, which was that just how much that the little boy, needed to be heard by the adults, and I arrived in the sort of the sexual assault victims suite in the newly built interview rooms in Scotland, for Police Scotland, where a lovely Sussex policeman sat down and said, "Well, here's a box of tissues, now let's talk about it." And I needed all those tissues. It was a wonderful experience. It was extraordinary. The grown-ups were listening, taking me seriously. And the third thing I hadn't expected was the volume of correspondence, which has really never stopped. I mean, it comes and goes. So within a couple of weeks of the article, I did a couple of radio interviews on the back of it, I had 300 disclosures in my inbox. And I think, because we unwisely, I now realise, put at the bottom of the email, if you had a bad experience supporting school, why not email Alex Renton? You can imagine. But that was immediately a huge challenge and a privilege, and I think people were, and it'd be interesting to go back. I mean, I've kept everything. People have permitted me to keep things, because this is all confidential. But if you assess those early emails that came in, I'd say over 60% were people who never disclosed to anybody, and I think the fact that I was both journalist and survivor, that was encouraging to them. About 30% of the emails were from women, and about 50% of those were partners, daughters, sisters, girlfriends, trying to track the root of the collateral horror that they'd lived through with damaged partners. Though a significant number of the women had themselves been abused at school. And then, of course, the thing that you'll all be well aware of is those emails that go, well, I don't think you could call it abuse, but I was horribly psychologically bullied within the school by peers or by teachers and so on. And then, of course, again, this is my psychologically innocent self in those days, people beginning to say, well, the very fact of you being sent there was an abuse. And I began to wake up to the fact of that. At the time my own children, my son was 15 and at day school, and my daughter 10, and there was never any question of sending them to boarding school. But I hadn't, like some of you, gone through I was never going to send my son to boarding school. My wife wouldn't have, it would have been insane. But I hadn't gone through that. They're the same age as I was, process that so many people do. So what happened then? Revert to the base thing, which is my profession of being a journalist, and realising there was more and more of a story that needed telling. And so I did I sort of cherry-picked among the emails coming in, and with the permission from people, the thing I wanted to do next was write about women. So I wrote about women's some terrible experiences at Gordonston, case which is still going on. It was settled earlier this year. And then I wrote a big article for the Observer about people who support, about the collateral damage, about the toll on partners and families. And that was sort of kind of interesting, and that of course generated more emails and more of a sense of the scale. And then the Observer said, because they've been funding this a bit, it was full-time work, said that's it, there's no more money in, we've had enough posh abuse. And I was sort of, but yes, it's posh, but it's the entire childcare system, because it's becoming increasingly obvious in everyone that the systems of the the elite schools and the paid-for schools were adopted elsewhere in childcare, and people who thought it was all right to cover up crimes for the good of for the reputation of the institution, would go and run borstalls and adoption centres and Barnardo's homes and so on. So these are all much of a muchness, but no, that was it. They'd had enough. So I kind of then sort of, so in 2015, 2016, sort of started writing a book, you know, because that's what you do. I teamed up with Nick Duffel and Simon Partridge and Sam and Sally. I've forgotten Sally's surname. Fraser. Sally Fraser. And because we decided, right, campaigns to end boarding. So we formed Boarding School Action, which still exists on Facebook. But we, you know, with I mean, I'm looking at Simon there. If you're smiling at him, I mean, we were pretty chipper about, you know, there was a real wave of enthusiasm coming. Boarding had to end. You know, we could really have a, you know, fast-moving, clever organisation that harnessed the media and get it done. And yeah, I'm afraid of, yeah, I sometimes think I am a campaigner, but I'm the kind of kiss of death to campaigns. Once I get on board, they seem to falter. But so I got involved in that, but I suppose the most useful thing I was doing was this, which is my my database, which, you know, it now I've taken. I mean, I did actually try and grab a page. It didn't really matter if I think it's all safe, the material in there, because I do to my correspondents promise confidentiality, particularly in their own details, and would never share anything of theirs without it. But I do collate overall the information and store it in that way. But nobody sees this. I tend to, so I think maybe I should explain. I mean, so if someone writes to me, as they do, on average, probably one a week, more when there's been stuff in the media, and says, I was at St Swithin's, do you have any record of it? Well, I write back going, I mean, no matter, you know, it depends on the level of, sometimes people want to give you a lot of detail, sometimes none. But essentially saying I'm very happy to record that, I'll keep your personal details in confidence, and I'll tell you if I've had any other reports of St Swithin's, and if it's suitable and others agree, I can put you in touch with other people who were at St Swithin's. I can also, you know, there may be a police investigation going on, and I can hook them up with the police officer or whatever. So that's how that begins. I mean, generally there'll be an email back with some more detail and permission to record the detail, yeah, like the name of a teacher and dates. And at that point, I will then write to other correspondents if asked and say, would you like to talk to this person? It's all quite, but you have to do it like that. I mean, it's all quite painstaking. But and otherwise, I mean, I use the information. So if a journalist rings me and goes, do you have anything on St Swithin's? Because someone's come forward, I will go, I have X number of reports, and I can ask the people who reported if they want to talk to you and connect them up, but it has to be done that way. But the other thing I should say, because many of you are, how many practicing therapists are there in the room actually? Yay, it's not good to see. But I can't. I mean, I have very standard letters, and I try and tailor them to the type of the kind of disclosure I'm getting. But trying to say, this course you're starting on may well be helpful, but I would suggest, if you haven't already, seeking some sort of trauma-conscious therapy first, because the course you're beginning, which may end up in the police station or may end up in the papers or end up with what will inevitably be a disappointing interaction with the institution itself, can be very re-traumatizing. And you need to look after yourself first. So I do, and then I usually link people with BSS-Support or Nick Duffel's Boarding School Survivors course and things like that. What I try to also say is I am not a therapist. They really, really don't want to talk to me about that, and I won't. And I also try to avoid conversations. I try to keep this to email. But anyway, so that, I mean, and that work, continues. It's great. It's a privilege. I mean, I think the database is an amazing thing now. I mean, and it's, I've always say we've had about a dozen successful prosecutions as a result of it. So that's people. But I think, but you all know that the work is far more important than getting those sick, nasty, evil men and women behind bars. It's about people not feeling alone, about feeling there is some outlet for the anger they have, and very often people who have never are too proud or too self-critical to seek any kind of help at all, realizing that seeking help is actually common. Lots of people do it. It's no shame, and it works. So that's, I think that's probably the most useful thing about it. And people, I mean, people can write to me and ask about their school and feel they have done something, and then hopefully get some talking therapy, but not CBT. The CBT damage done to people who suffer childhood trauma, I'm sure you're all aware that the problems around that. So and meanwhile, I sort of continued with I published this book. This got a bit of attention. It's still in print. And which is really an attempt to try and look deeper into to not the psychology, but the social culture of a nation that, in the words of one French ambassador, hates its own children, and has for years seen just as Elon Musk spotted that, or been half in love with the credo that suffering makes a more special adult. And that someone who will stand out and achieve. And in the years since, I mean, I do other work. I mean, I have a career as a historian and as a food writer as well, which is doesn't sit very comfortably with this. But I mean, as things come and go, I take part in radio podcasts and as a talking head, and occasionally I write things, usually the same story for the umpteenth time. One thing about journalism is we don't write the head. People often write to me, go, why was that dreadful headline on your piece? How could you write that? And I go, we don't write the headlines. I didn't write, as a petrified 9-year-old, I was tormented into silence. That's actually, I didn't even write it. It was the Daily Mail that wrote it, and then decided to make it look as though I'd written it. But these are the things you know. I mean, for me, it's more useful getting. We used to talk about this a lot in boarding school action, getting a headline in the Daily Mail than it is in the Guardian. Getting a letter saying boarding school is bad and must end in the Guardian is of no campaigning use whatsoever. You have to take the fight to the enemy, and so the Sunday Times and the Daily Mail are going to be a better outlet. So I mean, maybe now moving on to that. I'm happy to answer questions about that. I mean, the most recent thing some of you've seen, yet again, that photo is on websites across the country. I was approached by the BBC earlier this year, who really, with a look at ICSA, the child abuse inquiries in Scotland and here coming out, and what new there was to do. And I said, well, there isn't anything, but I'm prepared to use the information I have to talk about how the elite schools covered up, and how that habit seems to have spread across the whole system, including into the state childcare systems, of course, as well, and they're still doing it. So that's really why we made this In Dark Corners series. That then, that went out and got some attention, and it was top of the charts. Ziggy Stardust at 50 was dropped. We was beaten off #1 in the BBC charts by that programme. I was very pleased about that. But Ziggy Stardust at 50 is a really good show, actually. But then, Power of Celebrity, this man, Nicky Campbell, on Radio 5, realised that one of the people we'd featured, he was a teacher from his own school, and then started, and still is, talking about that. And suddenly my inbox had more emails from CSA survivors and people who'd suffered in other ways at residential childcare institutions than ever, because of one, minor celebrity on Radio 5 talking about it. It was absolutely amazing, and as a campaigner, interesting just what celebrity will do. But does this stuff bring any change? I think, this is the great question. And I think, I've been a journalist a long time. I've been a tabloid journalist. I've been a journalist on serious papers. I've done broadcast TV, news, wars, development NGO work. I'm as disenchanted by the media as the rest of you. I do defend it because I don't see a better system emerging from the new technology. But if anything, the media's got worse because of the new technology. But the truth is, if we're looking back at other survivors telling their stories, and a lot of people get in touch with me wanting to publish a book or have their story told in the media. The first job, if appropriate, is to sort of try and talk through what that means and how it's achievable, and is it worth it? The media, this is a fool's guide. You all know these things. These are the things that get your story told in the media. The novelty first, the simple tale, sensation. I was there, I saw it. This happened to me, now I'm telling everything for the first time. And ask, when you're getting into campaigning, the ask needs to be really clear. Boarding must end. But it also needs to be possible. Boarding must end, I don't think in this current climate is possible, but there are other ways to bring that about. But the immediacy, the peg. On Tuesday it will be 20 years since this happened. And celebrity, as you see, I'm sure that my story was easier to tell because of my small reputation as a journalist, but also because of my father's celebrity. Nicky Campbell, who I only kind of knew as a breakfast radio show host, but is a huge figure, it turns out, and him getting on board with that has been the biggest thing that's happened in CSA school campaigning. I put it in that bracket, for quite a long time.
CSA.
Well, I mean campaigning around the safeguarding of children from child sexual abuse. CSA is child sexual abuse. So I suppose the next question is why tell your story publicly? So I don't think, my experience is clearly not typical at all. But there are good reasons, and I think the one I haven't listed here is validation. If you're a survivor of ACEs at school or of child sexual abuse, having your story acknowledged in public is a really important part, or you may see it as a really important part of some form of therapeutic healing process, and it can be. And clearly we all know from looking at the newspapers and at the bookshelves, the misery memoir is a known genre that sells. And you can ask whether people who've been down that road have found peace and satisfaction through doing it. Some have found money through doing it, which is another help. But I think there are reasonable aims. So I think the people who do write their own stories or tell their own stories are looking after at these. The revenge and redress is clearly the key one, and there's no doubting that revenge can be therapeutic. We all know that there are dangers in anger, but cold and calculated revenge against the adults who denied denied you a voice and kept you quiet is a good thing to do. Redress is much harder. I mean, I'm going to get onto that when we talk about risks. But it's clear that the sort of institutions that the boarding school institutions, those that are still around, will not, until taken absolutely to the wall and their insurers sued to bits, admit any liability at all. They can't. Their lawyers tell them not to. But so people who go back to the brick mother in that wonderful phrase and ask the brick mother to say sorry, I mean the school, are getting for a big disappointment. It just won't happen. And to support survivors, I think that's probably the most useful thing that media work can do. I mean, you can help survivors who are seeking compensation or campaigning to be heard, or to, particularly to get more witnesses to come forward if there's a chance of a criminal prosecution. Those are all good things. As I said, recruiting witnesses. And then, of course, the campaign aims. I mean, clearly, if we're going to end boarding, the media is a part of that work, and telling personal stories is a part of getting it done. But, well, there are lots of buts there. The justice for survivors, and for me, more recently, really all the work I do at the moment in public is ideally aimed at the hope of getting mandatory reporting, which has now been in a very lukewarm form suggested by the final report of the English child abuse inquiry. And the campaign now, which I hope you're all on top of, is to make sure the legislation that brings in mandatory reporting, not just of sexual abuse, but psychological abuse and anything else inside institutions that care for the vulnerable, give it real teeth as the legislation finally comes forward. Because I think if we get mandatory reporting on sexual abuse of children and in other vulnerable groups and institutions, if that comes through, then psychological abuse will be pulled in as well, and we'll begin to find a lot of ways of, through legislation and through oversight, stopping the kind of abuses that happened to the people, to us and the people we know. Yes, I won't go. I mean, an obvious list of the different ways of telling your story, all of them with their problems. And I mean, yes, I mean a little on risks. I mean, I think I do spend a lot of time in the slightly sad job of telling people that they, even if they manage to get a newspaper to hear their story, which is hard, and their story may get twisted, because particularly if you want to tell a story of the psychological damage of boarding school, that's very hard, not nearly as easy to make interesting to the average media outlet as a story of an abusive teacher sexually assaulting children. It's never going to grab the headlines. And I have conversations with very grown-up, sensible outlets and BBC outlets and so on, saying, I really am not going to do a CSA revelation story unless we give equal time to the psychological damage done just by the fact of early boarding, or however you want to put it. And they kind of go, yeah, we'll do that, but we need some of the nasty stuff in there. Not my fault. And I've had sensible documentary makers saying, well, we can do anything you like, but without a celebrity, we're not going to get the programme off the ground. So you just... the other thing in risk is definitely collateral damage. I think people, and certainly that's been true in my own case, don't assess properly just how the damage they may do in their own familial and social networks. And how when they come up and ask for understanding and sympathy, that there are people who they love and trust who won't have that available to give. And that really needs proper assessment before you tell any story. I think the message often fails. I mean, people come up with they want to have quite a complex message about the problems in the system and the problems around the way way we treat children in this country, and it just gets refined down to, you know, my hell and my hell on the playing fields, you know, or my hell behind. Sorry, I just don't want to say this in too triggering a way, but you know, the awful thing that happened to me when I was 9, rather than the broad discussion of how we stop these things happening. And often, if you go public with your story and it doesn't work out in the way you didn't, i.e. you don't get the old headmaster apologising from his retirement home, or you don't get the police going, we must act today, or questions raised in Parliament, that will compound the trauma, because you, yet again, the grown-ups aren't listening, and you're not being treated justly. And unless you're ready for that to happen, you can't really start the process. There's another issue which I know about personally. I do hear from other survivors who are unhappy that some schools get attention and others don't. They're unhappy that the schools I went to personally get a lot of attention, it's hard. I mean, you can only really apologise for that. Anyone who wants to use me will always start with my story, because that tells the audience why I have a right to speak. And I'm not established enough just to be an expert, and I'm not interesting unless I say I'm a victim of abuse, psychological and sexual at school. That's what kicks it off. So there is a skewing. I mean, I do, you know, over the years, I've made programs and TV programs and radio programs and news, and we have probably looked at 20 schools. I have 300 schools that need looking at in my database, and journalists ring up and go, I mean, it just happened to me the other day. I mean, they said, who hasn't? What schools have a lot of allegations that have never been looked at? And I go, okay, the Dragon, Oxfordshire, famous school, patronised by Oxford academics, liberals. Unbelievable levels, volume of complaints, numbers of complaints, and clearly cover-ups. And the man went, any celebrities go there? I mean, and that's kind of it. I'm much less able to direct media attention than I think some people who criticise my work imagine. And I'm a freelance. I'm not on anyone's staff. I'm not on anyone's salary. I can only try and push, but it is hurtful and harming possibly to other survivors to find that there is attention being focused on schools which maybe don't look as though they had as harsh problems as X school or Y school, but they get no attention. But to that, well, you could say that is the media. It's a blunt and very difficult force to direct. But if there are any journalists here, or anyone who knows journalists who are looking for boarding school stories, I've got them, and I will produce a top 10 of schools that you can look at. And they're not all about sexual abuse. They are often about the more complex issues. So what is success? Can you read that? This is in Private Eye in the summer. It says, Careers Officer, apart from running a controversial podcast exposing the abuses of the public school system, what else would you like to do? Finally, and let's move to questions. Looking forward, I keep thinking I've kind of stopped doing the active media work on this story, and I'm just going to keep my database going and answer queries and point survivors who come to me towards help and support. But then another media thing comes along. We are making another episode of that In Dark Corners series from the summer. Still available on BBC iPlayer, BBC Sounds, because something interesting has happened, and maybe no doubt that'll go on happening. But I kind of say I won't do any work unless it's looking at how we make the system safer for children today, and that's not just the private boarding school system. It's all residential care. It's all care for children within institutions. And for me, that then goes to elder care as well. There's no mandatory reporting in old people's homes either, and it's desperately needed. So I think, as I said, I think mandatory reporting can extend way beyond sexual abuse. It's a system that works in many countries around the world. We don't have it here. We need it here in a better form than is currently proposed to go to Parliament, and we need to be campaigning hard to do that now. And I think we need to support Tom Perry, who some of you know, famous boarding school survivor, who has done amazing work, kind of almost Jonathan Lewis and him, really not many more of them over the years, to get mandatory reporting, you know, up at the top of the agenda. And there's one final push to get good mandatory reporting into British law. In terms of the wider thing, I've moved to North. I mean, my children went to private school. I've never made any secret of it. I now think that a decent, equitable Britain needs to be a Britain without private schools, and I think that that's something that interests me a lot. But I think addressing the private school system within the political system we have at the moment is about incremental things, and ending charitable status, as soon should happen in Scotland, and the tax breaks that keep these schools going is very much part of it. It's interesting, I mean, I look back at when Sam and Simon and Nick and I were campaigning 6-7 years ago. We were talking about campaigning. Our ideas then, we were going to challenge, do you remember, Simon, boarding under human rights law? And now we have a country that's about trying to get out of the Convention on Human Rights.
We haven't gone forward very much there.
No, exactly. And we were going to pressure the royals not to send their children to boarding school. I mean, I think there are ways to win this hearts and minds battle. It's really depressing that even despite COVID, the number of boarders in Britain's schools today is about the same as it was in 2000. Where it stabilised after declining through the 90s. But, you know, I think, you know, the economic changes, the fact that the middle-class Britons may get much poorer, the kind of Britons who can afford to send their children to private school and boarding school, you know, that may be the change we get. But there is a hearts and minds battle. I think we can arrive at a Britain where it is impossible in a middle-class dinner party to go, well, Johnny is at St George's and Priscilla's at St Margaret's, because enough people go, are you absolutely crazy? And we just need to keep telling our stories for that. I think, I mean, I was trying to, you know, just to sum up, I was thinking about this late last night. I mean, I think back to the very basic thing about telling us, a lot of people who write to me, you know, often go, can we have a phone conversation? And I go, why don't you write it down? One page of A4, 20 pages of A4. Get it written, and then your story exists outside you. It's not just those bubbling thoughts in your head. I'll read it. Maybe your friends and family will read it. And you're at the beginning of a process. So maybe getting your story heard is, first of all, being heard by your own self. And I think and now looking back, that's what I did. I needed to come out in order to find out what was going on in me. But that's my psychological makeup. But it's so all of us need to get back to that child who still needs hearing, and and who can be helped from where we are now. So writing your story, getting your story, telling your own story to yourself in a formalized way is the beginning of a process that can be really fruitful, even if you don't get on the front page of the Daily Mail. Thanks. I think that's it. Yes.